Shalom from Jerusalem. This is TV7's Israel at War update. And as we mark today, day 497 since the Islamist Hamas launched its heinous onslaught on southern Israel on October 7th of 2023, we are right now in a less than 24 hours before the looming deadline initially voiced by U.S. President Donald Trump with regard to his demand that Hamas release all hostages. Israel, on the other hand, has mentioned that it will back President Trump's ultimatum. Nevertheless, the current understanding here in Jerusalem is that there might be something else on the horizon. But on that and much more, let's now turn to TV7's editor-at-large, Mr. Amir Oren. Amir, what can you update us with?
So, as we are set to mark the 500-day watershed next week on Monday, this is Israel's longest war ever, longer than the 1948 war, which started in late 47 and was really finished in early 49, and longer than the war of attrition in 1969-1970. The preparations that you mentioned obviously could have gone more discreetly. Nobody suspects that the IDF is not conducting its preparations, but obviously Netanyahu and Defense Minister Katz chose to do it semi-publicly in order to signal the seriousness in which Israel viewed what seemed at the time as a crisis. However, earlier today, Hamas released the names, not yet the hostages themselves. Three of them, Mr. Horn, Mr. Dekel Khan, and Mr. Trofanov. Netanyahu responded somewhat awkwardly because he used a word which in Hebrew serves two distinct meanings, both accept and receive. Earlier, he said that the list is acceptable to Israel. Then he corrected it to say he only meant that Israel is in acceptance of the list. But obviously, the crisis, if there is going to be one, was put off until next week. And we have already lost a week in negotiating the next stage of the hostage release deal, which is supposed to start in a couple of weeks now. In the meantime, of course, the most pressing, the urgent need is to see what happens in the north. In the Lebanon-Israel ceasefire, which is actually Hezbollah-Israel, about to be over in midweek, perhaps extended by 10 days until the last day of February. But again, right now there is no horizon, and there is quite a conflict between what Israel insists on, and that is the 5 points which it still wants to occupy in southern Lebanon, and the other powers, of course, along with Lebanon, who insist on full Israeli withdrawal.
Indeed. Well, there was a meeting earlier today at Nakura, the UNIFIL base there, provided the facilities for a meeting, a five-way meeting to include also France, the United States, CENTCOM for that matter, the IDF, UNIFIL, and the UNIFIL, and Lebanese armed forces indeed. During this meeting, they did discuss about a long list of issues, particularly Hezbollah continuing to violate the ceasefire time and again, forcing Israel to respond, and all the while also the Iranian uptick in efforts to transfer illicit funds, specifically to various Hezbollah operators that then distributed based on the interests of this Iranian proxy in Lebanon. And on that, I'd like to turn to Washington, D.C., where we're joined by His Excellency, Mr. Marshall Billingsley, formerly the Assistant Secretary General of NATO. Under the previous Trump administration, he served also as the Assistant Secretary of the Treasury for countering illicit funds, and currently, of course, a senior fellow at Hudson Institute. It's great to see you, Marshall. I'd like to immediately ask you on the Lebanese file specifically. What are we to expect from those efforts to transfer funds in order to once again rearm and rebuild Hezbollah, something that the Iranians are quite open about? Is this something that we're expected to see Israel, and more specifically the United States, which has relaunched the maximum pressure campaign against the Iranians, sit idly by and just let it happen? Or is there going to be some sort of course of action to stop that?
There has to be a course of action to stop that. And there has been some significant successes, but the Iranian in terms of stopping it, but the Iranians will continue. The Lebanese have somewhat asserted themselves at their airport in Beirut, which was considered generally controlled by Hezbollah. They have interdicted a number of bulk cash shipments that were coming into the country by air. And they've made very, very clear that they will continue to inspect even diplomatically packaged contents because that's how the Iranians are endeavoring to bring the money in. We're, of course, approaching the funeral of Nasrallah, and there will be, of course, an uptick both in Iranian activities associated with that and further efforts to smuggle money in surrounding that moment. The United States has endeavored to put pressure on the Lebanese government to push Hezbollah out of the government formation process. My friend Morgan Ortagus, who is the deputy presidential envoy for the Middle East, was there last week to do exactly that. So the United States has shown that it is quite intent on taking the next step in pressuring Lebanon to distance itself from this terrorist organization.
On the latter point, I'd like to ask you, since Nawaf Salam, the Prime Minister of Lebanon, has announced the new government, as part of which 5 portfolios were given to the Shiite population as part of the Taif agreements, but within that context, 4 of them went to Amal, which is the closest ally of Hezbollah in Lebanon. Is that not a red line that should also be adhered to?
Not necessarily. The Shia community is really divided between Amal and Hezbollah. Amal has originated, as you know, as the voice of the community and steadily lost ground to Hezbollah over the years, ultimately becoming their patsy. Nabi Berri, the Speaker of the Parliament, is the leader of Amal. He, at one point in his life, was in violent opposition to Hezbollah, but in recent decades has done nothing but cover for them. Let's see if he sees an opening now to reassert himself and to recapture the leadership of the Shia community with his political movement. If he is willing to turn on Hezbollah and to do that demonstrably with actual action on the ground, then that probably should be welcomed.
Indeed. Well, let's turn to elsewhere here in Israel, where we're joined by Brigadier General in Reserve Relik Shafir, formerly an Israel Air Force commander, as well as a fighter pilot. It's good to see you, General. I'd like to ask you particularly about the incident that occurred yesterday, when on the one hand, the Lebanese authorities have prevented an Iranian aircraft from landing in the international airport in Beirut, following a intelligence confirmation that indicated that there are, again, illegal funds on board earmarked for Hezbollah in Lebanon, bringing about a very precarious situation in which we're seeing hundreds upon hundreds of Hezbollah supporters trying to overrun the airport. As Mr. Billingsley also mentioned, the airport is situated inside of the Dahya neighborhood, the Shia neighborhood of Beirut, and therefore the proximity and at some points even allowed Hezbollah to take over the airport when they were strong enough to do so. The Lebanese army pushed back, but at the same time, is there something that Israel can do in order to prevent those activities from continuing?
I think if you, if I read between the lines of the Iranian quotes, they blame Israel for threatening that particular flight and deviating from established laws or aerial laws. And I suspect that there might be something into it where the Lebanese were coerced more or less to refuse the landing of the Iranian plane. So as we know in the Middle East, nothing is really as it seems on the front stage. Most of the action happens behind the stage. And I think Israel is pushing Lebanon as much as it can to present a more force and handle Hezbollah in such a manner as to take them off both militarily and politically. So within these pressures, you could see the visit of the U.S. envoy last week in Lebanon and then in Israel, and the hassle that took place because of her one of her middle fingers that happened to have a Jewish Magen David. So the pressures behind the scenes are who's going to be responsible for the area south of the Litani being clear of Hezbollah. If the Lebanese army cannot take control of that area, and it probably can't, then Israel will, unless some foreign forces, maybe the French, show enough latitude in enforcing Hezbollah to get out. Until this thing is cleared, we're going to get to the February 18th without a clear path forward, where Hezbollah is trying to infiltrate that area. Israel is quite resolute in not allowing them to do so. International communities pressuring Israel to withdraw. Israel wants to stay in control points. It probably, I don't think Israel will push it to a point of conflict and will probably withdraw, but add a lot more aerial activity against Hezbollah, both in the areas south of the Litani and further north in the Bekaa Valley and the Syrian Lebanese borders. So we're going to see some low-level conflicts for quite a while until the something gives in.
Well, we'll continue to follow the situation in Lebanon very closely, since this could erupt, of course, into what may then lead to a civil war, and that is something that everybody wants to avoid. With regard to the French, I have a lot of question marks, especially in light of their recent losses throughout the continent of Africa in particular, whether they're the most potent nation capable of ensuring that Hezbollah is diminished, at least to the point where it cannot or can no longer pose a threat to the state of Israel. But Mr. Oren, I'd like to pivot somewhat eastward towards Syria. The situation is still quite fluid, but nonetheless, there was a conference in France hosted by French President Emmanuel Macron. We saw there the GCC, the Arab League. We saw multiple Arab countries, but also European countries, such as, for instance, Germany, coming to that meeting and really trying to find a certain common ground to try and support the Al Qaeda HTS group from consolidating their power in Damascus. That is, of course, in my opinion, quite preposterous, considering the fact that just 1 week before that, HTS announced that it would lengthen a contract of a French conglomerate for them to work their various ports. So, on the one hand, you see that there are dealings of business behind the scenes, and ultimately those lead to the decision making of states in order to somehow support something that shouldn't really happen. But nonetheless, I'd like to hear your opinion on that.
So, of course, historically, France had a foothold in the Levant when the entire region was divided between Great Britain and France. After World War I, France had Syria and Lebanon. And obviously, President Macron has some ambitions regarding a return to those halcyon days, but it's not going to happen because Syria will be decided in a pay grade above Macron's, and that is between Presidents Trump and Putin. When they decide what will happen in the Ukraine war, it will also have implications regarding the Middle East, not necessarily a condominium, that might be too definitive a statement. But nevertheless, if Trump decides to let Putin have his naval bases in Syria, naval and air bases in Syria, so be it. We know that President Ahmed al-Shara, the freshly minted, self-minted president ruler of Syria, is now on better terms with Putin. They have talked. They are arranging a visit. We don't know what will happen to Bashar Assad during that time, but we may well see Trump taking out the American troops out of Syria in some sort of arrangement with Russia. Our preconceptions up to until a month ago may no longer be valid. So it won't be decided either in Damascus or in Paris.
Well, I agree about Washington having leverage over the Syrian file. I don't see Russia having that leverage, but of course, we'll have to wait and see how that evolves. Mr. Billingsley, I'd love to hear your take on Syria, to keep into our minds the fact that Abu Muhammad al-Julani, the self-minted president, as Mr. Owen put it, doesn't control more than a third of the country at this point. 2/3 are not under his control. He has no capacity to force his way there since Israel destroyed all the munitions that the Assad regime left behind, and therefore he's quite in a precarious position in which he requires international support in order to try and consolidate realities on the ground.
Absolutely. I just want to come back to one thing that General Shafir mentioned that caught my attention. Just for your viewers to understand, $1 million, it's not like Ocean's 11 in the movies where you can run around with 1, 2, 5 duffel bags and carry $1 million. But it's actually not a sizable cube. It's about a 5-foot by 5-foot cube that would be $1 million. So these plane flights that are coming in actually can carry quite a lot of money, particularly in a country whose economy is as devastated as Lebanon's has been by their own doing. Had nothing to do with Israel or the war, but by Lebanese corruption and mismanagement and Hezbollah's blockade of government formation. On to Syria, a couple of things. First of all, Jonathan, I perhaps you have mentioned to your viewers, but a longtime participant in your programming and a friend of mine and a fellow also at the Hudson Institute has now been named as the assistant secretary, or has been nominated to be the assistant secretary for the Middle East region, and that is Joel Rayburn. Joel was the Syrian envoy for President Trump, the first administration. And Joel, his relationship with Syrian human rights organizations, his efforts against Assad were significant and were unabating. And I'm sure that once he is in his position, he and Morgan Ortagus, who, as was mentioned, converted to Judaism as a phenomenal actor, that there will be an unrelenting level of pressure on the new Al Qaeda, once Al Qaeda regime in Syria to abandon their ways, to push the Russians out. So I'm hopeful that there will not be an accommodation of Putin in Syria. That has historically not been Joel's approach to things, and time will tell. Now, with regard to France and Lebanon, I'm skipping around because we covered a lot of topics here, but as your senior editor mentioned, France is not the global player that they think they are. They have chronically underinvested in their defenses, in their military expenditures. They've been well below 2% for the past many decades. And while it doesn't take a huge amount of money to fund and to operate ground forces in Lebanon, it's pretty much going to stretch them as far as they can go. And of course, in Washington this past week, all eyes have been on the topic of Ukraine, with some interesting and somewhat contradictory signals coming from Washington with regard to our approach. But there is one thing that is crystal clear, which is that the Trump administration expects Europe to step up and take the primary driver's seat in dealing with the matter of Ukraine once a ceasefire is arranged. Doing that will require France to fully commit itself in that effort as well. So I would not expect great things, even though Macron's eyes may be big, his appetite maybe somewhat suppressed.
Indeed. Well, I think it's an important point to highlight. I don't think there's anybody in the current Trump administration in relevant positions who would agree to consolidate the power of HTS in Damascus. And that is something to take note of, and that is something that President Trump, also in his morning briefings and during the day, will hear over and over again from people like Tulsi Gabbard, for instance, just recently confirmed by the Senate Director of National Intelligence, who stated in her confirmation hearing that she hates the fact, doesn't only hate Al Qaeda, but she hates the fact that there are countries who are willing to accept Al Qaeda taking over Damascus. So I think that many people need to take note of those facts. I know that our Turkish friends have not done so, and when I pointed that out, they were somewhat dismayed by that fact. But nonetheless, we don't have very much time left, and I'd like to hear General Shafil's point of view on this as well. When we're talking about Syria specifically, what does Israel need to maintain when we're talking about red lines specifically?
Israel has several interests in that area, and the most important are a watchful eye over the southern Golan Heights, where there may be Iranians infiltrating to harass Israel on its Golan border. And for that reason, Israel took control of the Syrian Mount Hermon, which overlooks all that basin, and the demilitarized zone to make sure that we have a buffer between the Syrian lines and Israel proper. The second interest is making sure that the Druze community, which is on the eastern side of the Golan Heights, is safe and secure because Israel has quite a few Druze, most of whom serve in the military, and a lot of casualties in this war were by Druze soldiers. So Israel has a commitment, a long-standing commitment to the Druze community, and making sure that their counterparts in Syria proper are safeguarded. So these two are the basic elements. Israel also doesn't want to see Turkey drive a wedge into Syria because the Turks have a tendency to dream about their past, about the Ottoman Empire, and they're taking themselves, at least Erdogan, seems to take himself a little too seriously. So this is also posed an imposing threat, possible threat. So these are the 2 points concerning Syria, which is actually without doubt militarily out for quite a few years.
Thank you, General Shafir. I think it's important to highlight that the Druze have fought in all of Israel's wars since its inception in 1948. And in every war, unfortunately, regrettably, many Druze troops have paid the ultimate price for the state of Israel. And with regard to Syria and something that Marshall mentioned about the capacity of France to interfere, particularly also in Lebanon or in Syria, the last time it was ruling Syria, it lost the war versus Sultan Bashar al-Atrash and his forces during the Druze revolt of the 1920s, and it left Syria, withdrew towards Lebanon proper, and while it left Syria between the 18th of October to the 21st of October of 1925, it actually bombed Damascus for 3 whole days, destroying entire neighborhoods, killing hundreds of people, and wounding thousands upon thousands more. And that is still ingrained in the memory of many elderly Syrians who heard the stories and understand the dynamics of Syrian society. But nonetheless, this is all the time that we have for today. I'd like to immediately thank General Shafir, Mr. Billingsley, and Mr. Oren for all of your insights, and I'd like to thank all of you at home as well. Until our next edition from here in Jerusalem. Shalom.
I'm Eran Etzion, former Deputy National Security Advisor here in Israel, a diplomat, a strategist by training. I'm very happy to be at TV7 and offer my interpretation along my esteemed colleagues. The strong point of TV7 is to be a reliable source of authoritative insight in an era of shallow news environment that is very difficult for viewers to trust.